At the pool, a lifeguard pulled me aside and said, "I need you to go to the ER right now." The community pool smelled like chlorine and sunscreen, exactly the way summer should smell when you're trying to forget that your life is falling apart. I'd brought my son Liam there because his mother, my ex-wife, had canceled her weekend visitation again, third time this month, and the kid needed something normal after another disappointment. He was 7 years old with my dark hair and his mother's green eyes, currently doing cannonballs off the side while other kids cheered him on. I sat on a plastic lounge chair that was probably older than I was, scrolling through work emails I didn't care about, trying not to think about the bills piling up or the custody hearing scheduled for next month. The sun was hot on my shoulders, and for maybe 15 minutes, I felt something close to peace. That's when the lifeguard approached. Young guy, maybe 22, with that build that comes from spending every summer swimming and the kind of tan that suggested this wasn't just a job, but a lifestyle. His name tag said Derek, and he had that serious expression that made my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. I assumed Liam had done something wrong, broken some pool rule I wasn't aware of, but Derek wasn't looking at my son. He was looking at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He crouched down next to my chair so we were at eye level and spoke quietly, like he didn't want other people to hear. He said he needed me to go to the emergency room right now, that he'd noticed something while I was in the water earlier, and it required immediate medical attention. My first reaction was to laugh because that was absurd. I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. I'd lost 15 pounds stress dieting through the divorce. I told Derek he must be mistaken, that I was perfectly healthy, but he wasn't smiling. He asked when I'd last seen a doctor, and I had to think about it. Maybe 2 years? 3? I'd been on my wife's insurance until the separation, and I hadn't bothered getting my own yet because it was expensive, and I felt fine. Derek's expression got more serious. He said he was a certified lifeguard and CPR instructor. That part of his training included recognizing medical emergencies, and what he'd observed qualified as an emergency. I asked what exactly he'd observed, feeling my heart rate pick up, despite my skepticism. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then pointed at my torso. He said when I'd been swimming with Liam, he'd noticed my ribcage on the right side was significantly more prominent than the left, that my breathing pattern was asymmetrical, and that I had visible distension in my abdomen that hadn't been there when I checked in 2 hours ago. I looked down at myself, at the body I'd been living in for 34 years, and tried to see what he was talking about. My ribs did look a bit uneven, maybe, but I'd always been skinny. The abdomen thing was probably just bloating from the gas station burrito I'd eaten for lunch. I told Derek I appreciated his concern, but I was fine, that he was probably seeing things. His jaw tightened, and he pulled out his phone, swiped to the pool's security camera footage from earlier. He showed me a video of myself diving into the pool, and I had to admit the image was unsettling. My right side did look wrong somehow, like the architecture of my ribcage had shifted. And when I surfaced in the video, I could see my stomach was noticeably distended, pressing against my swim trunks in a way that looked more like late pregnancy than bloating. But this was insane. I'd looked normal this morning when I got dressed. Bodies didn't just change shape in a few hours. Derek explained that rapid abdominal distension combined with respiratory asymmetry could indicate internal bleeding, organ failure, or a dozen other conditions that would kill me if I ignored them. He said he'd already called his supervisor, who'd agreed this warranted emergency intervention, that they had a legal duty to report potential medical emergencies observed at the facility. I started to argue, to tell him he was overreacting, but then I noticed Liam watching us from the pool. My son's face had that pinched, worried expression he'd been wearing a lot lately, the look of a kid who'd learned too young that adults don't always have everything under control. I realized that whatever this was, even if Derek was wrong, I couldn't risk dismissing it and having something actually be wrong. Liam had already lost his stable family unit. He couldn't lose me too. I told Derek I'd go get checked out, more to make him stop looking at me with that concerned intensity than because I believed anything was actually wrong. He offered to call an ambulance, but I refused. Ambulances were expensive, and I had a car. He insisted that someone else drive me, that I shouldn't be behind the wheel if I was potentially experiencing a medical emergency. I pointed out that my son was here, and I couldn't exactly leave him at the pool. Derek's supervisor appeared then, a woman in her 40s named Gloria, who'd apparently been listening to the whole conversation. She said she'd watch Liam personally, that my son could stay in the shallow end under her direct supervision until I got back or arranged for someone to pick him up. The fact that they were this insistent made my denial start cracking. Something in their expressions told me this wasn't standard pool liability protocol. They genuinely believed I was in danger. I called my brother Marcus, explained the situation in the vaguest terms possible, and asked if he could come drive me to the hospital. He arrived 20 minutes later, took one look at me, and his face went pale. He asked why the hell I looked like that, why my stomach was sticking out like I'd swallowed a basketball, why I hadn't said anything about being sick. I looked down. Again, and this time I couldn't deny it. My abdomen had continued expanding while I'd been waiting. My swim trunks were cutting into my waist now, leaving red marks, and when I pressed on my stomach, it felt hard and wrong, like there was something solid in there that shouldn't be. The distension was significant enough that the family at the next lounge chair over was staring. A little girl pointed and asked her mother why that man's belly was so big, and the mother shushed her, but kept glancing over nervously. Marcus drove like we were in an action movie, taking corners too fast, running one yellow light that was definitely red by the time we cleared the intersection. I kept my hand pressed against my abdomen, feeling it continue to expand, the pressure building to something that was starting to hurt. Not sharp pain, but a deep, concerning ache that radiated through my torso. My breathing was getting harder too, like I couldn't quite fill my lungs completely. Marcus was on the phone with his wife, telling her to meet us at the hospital, to bring Liam there after he was done swimming, to clear his afternoon because this looked serious. I wanted to tell him he was overreacting, that I was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming that something was very wrong, that bodies don't do this, that I should be terrified, even though I couldn't quite access the terror through the fog of disbelief. The ER waiting room was packed, a Friday afternoon crowd of people with various ailments and injuries who'd been waiting for hours. Marcus bypassed the main desk and went straight to the triage nurse, a large black woman whose name tag identified her as Shanice. He started explaining, and she looked skeptical until she glanced over at me. Her expression changed instantly. She stood up, came around the desk, and lifted my shirt without asking permission. What she saw made her start moving fast. She called for immediate assistance, said something about code something or other, medical terminology I didn't understand, and suddenly I was being rushed through doors marked authorized personnel only, while other waiting patients complained about people cutting in line. A doctor who looked too young to have graduated med school appeared, pressed on my abdomen, looked at my asymmetrical ribcage, and called for imaging immediately. They put me in a wheelchair even though I could walk, rolled me through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and fear, and deposited me in a CT scanner before I'd fully processed what was happening. The technician was professional but moved with urgent efficiency, positioning me quickly, warning me the machine would make loud noises, telling me to hold still and breathe normally. The scan took maybe 10 minutes but felt like hours, lying there in that tube while the machine whirred and clicked around me, wondering what the hell it was finding inside my body. When they pulled me out, the technician wouldn't meet my eyes, which I'd learned from years of dating a nurse was never a good sign. Medical professionals who wouldn't look at you after seeing your results were medical professionals who'd seen something bad. Back in the ER bay, behind a curtain that provided the illusion of privacy, I waited. Marcus sat in the plastic chair next to the bed, scrolling through his phone nervously, occasionally looking up at me with an expression I couldn't read. The doctor returned with a tablet showing images I didn't understand, cross-sections of my torso that looked like alien landscapes. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel and asked if I wanted my brother to stay for this conversation. I said yes, because whatever this was, I didn't want to face it alone. Dr. Patel pulled up a chair, which I'd also learned from dating a nurse was never good. Doctors who sat down had bad news that required time to deliver. He asked if I'd been experiencing any symptoms lately. Fatigue, shortness of breath, abdominal pain, weight loss, night sweats. I realized with growing unease that I had been experiencing all of those things, but I'd attributed them to stress from the divorce. Dr. Patel explained what the CT scan had shown. My right lung was collapsed, compressed by something taking up space in my chest cavity. My liver was enlarged and displaced, pushed down and to the side by whatever was occupying the space where it should be, and my abdomen was filled with fluid, approximately 2 liters of it, which explained the rapid distension. The immediate concern was the mass itself, a tumor roughly the size of a grapefruit originating from somewhere in my chest cavity, pressing against my heart and major blood vessels. The collapse of my lung and the abdominal fluid were complications of the primary tumor. They were admitting me immediately, scheduling emergency surgery for tomorrow morning because waiting even a few days increased the risk of the tumor rupturing or completely cutting off blood flow to essential organs. My brain couldn't process the words. Tumor, surgery, emergency. These were things that happened to other people. Not to me, not now, not when I was already drowning in custody battles and financial stress. Marcus asked the question I couldn't formulate. Was it cancer? Dr. Patel's careful expression told me the answer before he spoke. They wouldn't know definitively until pathology examined the tissue after removal, but based on the imaging and the rate of growth, because comparing my scan to a chest x-ray I'd had 3 years ago showed this thing hadn't existed back then, the characteristics were consistent with aggressive malignancy. Lymphoma, possibly, or sarcoma, or one of several other cancers that grew fast and killed faster. They were bringing in an oncologist to consult before surgery, assembling a team because this wasn't a routine case. The tumor's location made it complicated. It was wrapped around blood vessels, pressing against my heart, adhering to my lung tissue. Removing it would be delicate, risky, potentially requiring them to repair or replace damaged vessels. The survival rate depended on multiple factors they wouldn't know until they opened me up. I asked how long I'd had this, how something this big could grow inside me without me noticing. Dr. Patel said that symptoms developed gradually, that the human body was remarkably good at adapting to slow changes. The fatigue, the weight loss, the difficulty breathing. I'd probably been experiencing increasing symptoms for months, but had attributed them to other causes. Stress was a convenient explanation that covered a multitude of actual medical issues. The rapid abdominal distension at the pool was likely because the tumor had finally grown large enough to completely obstruct venous return from my lower body, causing fluid to back up. If the lifeguard hadn't noticed, if I'd gone home and ignored it, I would have been dead by morning. The tumor would have either ruptured, causing massive internal bleeding, or compressed my heart enough to stop it. I'd had maybe 12 hours, possibly less, before catastrophic failure. The information kept coming, but I'd stopped processing it. They were wheeling me to a room, hooking me up to monitors, starting IV lines in both arms, giving me medications whose names I didn't catch. Marcus was making phone calls, coordinating who would pick up Liam from the pool, who would explain to my ex-wife that our custody hearing might need to be postponed because I was having emergency cancer surgery. A social worker appeared to discuss insurance, and I had to admit I didn't have any, that I'd been between coverage, that I'd been planning to enroll next month. Her expression was professionally sympathetic, but I could see her calculating the financial catastrophe this represented. A surgery this complex could cost $200,000, maybe more, and that was before chemotherapy or radiation or whatever other treatments came after. I was about to be bankrupted by the biological betrayal of my own cells. The oncologist arrived around dinner time. Dr. Elaine Morrison, sharp-eyed and in her 50s, with the kind of confidence that comes from decades of delivering terrible news. She reviewed my scans, asked detailed questions about family history. My father had died of colon cancer at 52, my grandmother of breast cancer at 61, and examined the tumor's characteristics on the imaging. She said the location and growth pattern were concerning, that this was likely a germ cell tumor or lymphoma, both of which were aggressive but potentially treatable. The good news, if there was any, was that these cancers responded well to chemotherapy when caught in time. The bad news was the size and location meant surgery first, then chemo, then possibly radiation, looking at 6 months to a year of treatment minimum. I'd need to stop working. I'd need help with Liam. My entire life was about to be consumed by fighting to keep that life. My ex-wife called while Dr. Morrison was still explaining treatment protocols. I let it go to voicemail because I couldn't face her yet, couldn't handle her reaction to this news. She'd left me 6 months ago, said she couldn't handle my depression anymore, that I'd become someone she didn't recognize. The irony wasn't lost on me that the depression she'd left me for was probably caused by the cancer literally eating my body from the inside. When I finally listened to her message later, her voice was cold, asking why Liam was being picked up by Marcus's wife instead of me, demanding to know what was so important that I disrupted the custody schedule we'd fought so hard to establish. No concern for my well-being, no worry about why I was in the hospital, just irritation that I'd inconvenienced her by being sick. They wheeled me to surgery at 6 a.m., after a sleepless night hooked to monitors that beeped with every heartbeat, every breath, constant reminders that my body was failing. The anesthesiologist was a calm woman who explained she'd be putting me to sleep, that I'd wake up in recovery, that the surgery would take 6 to 8 hours depending on complications. I asked what would happen if they couldn't remove it all, if the tumor was too entangled with vital structures. She was honest in a way I appreciated. They'd remove what they could safely take, leave what they couldn't, and deal with the remainder through other treatments. Worst case scenario, I'd wake up with the tumor still inside me, buying time with surgery, but not curing anything. I thought about Liam, about explaining to my son that his dad might not survive this, about all the moments I'd miss if this went wrong. Then the drugs hit my system and everything went black. I woke up to pain, not the dull ache of before, but sharp, screaming agony across my chest and abdomen, like someone had filleted me open and forgotten to close the wound properly. A nurse appeared, adjusted something on my IV, and the pain receded to manageable levels, leaving me floating in a morphine haze. Dr. Patel's face swam into focus. He said the surgery had gone as well as could be expected, that they'd removed the primary tumor and a significant portion of affected tissue. The tumor had been larger than anticipated, nearly the size of a cantaloupe by the time they'd excised it, and had required removing part of my right lung, part of my diaphragm, and a section of my pericardium, the sac, around my heart. They'd spent 2 hours reconstructing blood vessels, another hour repairing the damage to surrounding organs. I was lucky to be alive. The surgical team had genuinely questioned whether I'd survived the procedure. Pathology results came back 4 days later while I was still in the ICU, still hooked to a dozen machines, still trying to understand that my life had been divided into before and after by a Lifeguard's observation. Dr. Morrison delivered the news with her characteristic directness. Non-seminomatous germ cell tumor, stage 3B, with metastatic spread to lymph nodes they'd discovered and removed during surgery. This was a rare cancer, typically found in testicles or ovaries, occasionally in the chest cavity where it developed from cells left over from fetal development. It was aggressive, fast-growing, and if left untreated would have killed me within weeks. But it was also highly responsive to chemotherapy. She outlined a treatment plan, 4 cycles of BEP chemotherapy, 3 weeks per cycle, starting as soon as I'd healed enough from surgery. The side effects would be severe. I'd lose my hair, my immune system would crash. I'd be sick constantly. But the survival rate for my cancer type with this treatment protocol was around 70%. 70%, which meant 30% of people with my diagnosis died despite everything. I tried to find comfort in being on the survival side of that statistic, but couldn't shake the awareness that nearly a third of people in my situation would be dead within 5 years. Dr. Morrison explained that my prognosis was actually better than average because we'd caught it before it spread to my brain, or liver, because I was relatively young and otherwise healthy, because the surgical team had achieved clean margins. The lifeguard who'd noticed my asymmetrical breathing pattern had quite literally saved my life. If I'd ignored his warning, if I'd gone home that day, I would have died in my sleep that night when the tumor ruptured. Liam would have woken up the next morning to find his father's corpse. That alternate timeline haunted me more than the cancer itself. The custody hearing was postponed indefinitely, which my ex-wife contested through her attorney. She argued that my medical situation proved I was unfit to care for our son, that Liam needed stability I couldn't provide while undergoing treatment. Her lawyer filed motions requesting full custody with supervised visitation only after I completed treatment and could prove medical stability. I received these documents in my hospital bed, read through legal language that essentially argued I was too sick to be a father, and felt rage cut through the morphine haze. She'd abandoned our marriage when I needed her, hadn't bothered to visit me in the hospital, and was now using my cancer diagnosis as a weapon to take our son away. My attorney, a public defender named Rachel Gutierrez, who'd taken my case pro bono after hearing about my situation, said the courts actually looked unfavorably on parents who weaponized medical conditions. We'd fight it, she promised, but I needed to focus on survival first. Liam visited 3 days after surgery, brought by Marcus because my ex-wife refused to bring him to the hospital. My son stood in the doorway looking terrified, staring at his father connected to machines, chest covered in bandages, face hollowed by rapid weight loss and medical trauma. I tried to smile, tried to be the strong dad he needed, but my voice cracked when I said his name. He ran to the bed and carefully hugged me, avoiding the tubes and wires, crying into my shoulder while I held him with the arm that didn't have an IV line. I told him I was sick, but the doctors were fixing it, that I'd be okay. All the lies parents tell their children when they're not sure those lies are true. He asked if this was why I'd been so tired lately, why I couldn't play soccer with him anymore, why I'd been falling asleep during movies. I realized he'd been watching me decline for months, that children notice things adults try to hide, that I'd been failing him without even knowing it. The social worker who'd discussed my lack of insurance returned with paperwork for emergency Medicaid and hospital charity care programs. She explained I'd likely qualify based on income and medical necessity, that the hospital had funds for exactly these situations, but I'd still be responsible for significant costs. My credit would be destroyed. I'd be in medical debt for decades. She said it matter-of-factly, like financial ruin was just another side effect of cancer, which I suppose it was. I signed documents I barely read, agreed to payment plans I couldn't afford, and tried not to think about the fact that a lifeguard's observation had saved my life, but destroyed my financial future. The American healthcare system was structured so that survival came with permanent economic devastation if you weren't wealthy enough to absorb the costs. I started chemotherapy 3 weeks after surgery, still healing, still in constant pain, but Dr. Morrison insisted waiting longer increased the risk of metastatic spread. The infusion room was full of other cancer patients, a cross-section of humanity united by cellular rebellion. Old men with prostate cancer, young women with breast cancer, teenagers with leukemia, all of us connected to IV poles dripping poison into our veins in hopes of killing the bad cells faster than the good ones. The chemo made me sicker than I'd ever been in my life. I spent 3 days after each infusion vomiting until there was nothing left, my mouth full of sores, my body aching everywhere. My hair fell out in clumps, including eyebrows and eyelashes, leaving me looking like a ghost of myself. I lost 40 pounds. I couldn't work, couldn't care for Liam alone, couldn't do anything except exist between treatments and try to survive until the next one. Marcus and his wife Ellen became my primary support system. They moved me into their guest room because I couldn't afford rent anymore. They drove me to treatments, held me while I vomited, administered medications when I was too weak to manage them myself. They kept Liam on weekends when I had custody, making sure my son had some semblance of normal childhood while his father fought to stay alive. Ellen, who'd never been my biggest fan during the marriage, became an unexpected advocate, researching cancer treatments, finding support groups, bullying hospital administrators into processing my charity care applications faster. She said nobody deserved what I was going through, that despite our past differences, family helped family. I'd never been more grateful for people I'd previously taken for granted. My ex-wife filed another motion requesting emergency custody modification, citing my inability to care for Liam during treatment. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday when I had chemo on Thursday, meaning I'd show up to court sick, bald, and visibly dying. Her attorney clearly planned to use my appearance as evidence of instability. Rachel advised me to postpone again, but I refused. I'd already postponed twice for medical reasons. If I kept avoiding court, the judge would rule in my ex-wife's favor by default. So I showed up, still hooked to a portable medication pump under my shirt, face hollow, wearing a baseball cap to hide my baldness, and listened while my ex-wife's expensive attorney argued that I was unfit to parent. He presented medical records showing my diagnosis, treatment schedule, prognosis. He called it tragic, but insisted that Liam's needs superseded my emotional attachment, that a child deserved a stable home with a healthy parent, not someone who might not survive the year. Rachel Gutierrez stood up for my rebuttal and absolutely destroyed him. She introduced medical testimony from Dr. Morrison stating my prognosis was excellent, that I was responding well to treatment, that there was no medical reason I couldn't continue parenting with appropriate support. She presented testimony from Marcus and Ellen about the stable home environment they'd created for Liam during my treatment. She introduced statements from Liam's teachers saying he was thriving academically and socially despite his father's illness, that the consistency of seeing me regularly was beneficial for his emotional well-being. Then she played her trump card. She'd subpoenaed my ex-wife's phone records and text messages and presented evidence of her repeatedly canceling visitations, neglecting to show up for school events, and texting her new boyfriend about how my cancer diagnosis was convenient because it would help her win custody. The judge's expression changed from sympathetic to disgusted. The judge, an older woman named Hernandez who'd been on the bench for 20 years, addressed my ex-wife directly. She said she'd seen many custody disputes, but rarely such transparent manipulation of a parent's medical crisis. The court recognized that I was undergoing treatment for a serious illness, but nothing in the medical evidence suggested I was unable to parent during recovery. In fact, the stability I'd maintained for Liam despite my condition spoke to my commitment as a father. Judge Hernandez denied the motion for emergency custody modification, maintained the existing custody arrangement with modifications allowing Marcus and Ellen to supervise during my treatment weeks, and ordered my ex-wife to attend co-parenting counseling at her own expense. She concluded by noting that if my ex-wife filed another frivolous motion attempting to weaponize my medical condition, the court would consider it harassment and adjust custody in my favor. My ex-wife's attorney looked stunned. My ex-wife looked furious. I felt vindicated in a way that almost made the cancer worthwhile. I finished my 4th and final chemotherapy cycle in December, 6 months after that day at the pool. The scans showed no evidence of active disease, The surgery and chemo had worked. The cancer was in remission. Dr. Morrison cautioned that I'd need surveillance scans every 3 months for 5 years because germ cell tumors could recur, that I'd be living with the sword of Damocles hanging over me indefinitely. But for now, I was cancer-free. I was also broke, living in my brother's guest room, unable to work full-time due to lasting complications from surgery and chemo, but alive. My hair was growing back in patches. My energy was slowly returning. I could play soccer with Liam again, though I got winded quickly. I was rebuilding a life from the rubble the cancer had left behind, and some days that felt harder than fighting the cancer itself. The medical bills arrived in waves: hospital charges, surgical fees, anesthesia, ICU stay, pathology, oncology consultations, chemotherapy drugs, each statement representing thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. The charity care covered maybe 60%. Medicaid picked up another 20%. That left me personally responsible for approximately $40,000, an amount that might as well have been $1 million for someone who could barely afford groceries. Collection agencies started calling. Credit cards were maxed out from co-pays alone. I declared bankruptcy in January, standing in front of a judge who processed my case with bureaucratic efficiency, my financial life officially destroyed by the crime of getting sick without adequate insurance. The system had saved my life, then punished me for needing to be saved. I returned to the pool in March, 10 months after Derek the lifeguard had noticed my asymmetrical ribcage and potentially saved my life. I brought Liam for open swim on a Saturday, both of us back in the same water where this had all started. Derek was there, now apparently a shift supervisor based on his different colored shirt. He recognized me immediately and came over, asking how I was doing with genuine concern. I told him the short version: surgery, chemo, remission, still recovering. He looked relieved in a way that told me he'd been worried, that noticing something wrong had left him wondering if he'd done enough, if his intervention had mattered. I told him directly that he'd saved my life, that I'd had maybe 12 hours before the tumor ruptured, that if he hadn't insisted I go to the ER, my son would be fatherless. He got emotional, actually teared up, and said he'd just been doing his job, but I could tell it meant something to know his observation had made a difference. We talked for a while, Derek and I, sitting on those same plastic lounge chairs while Liam played in the water. He explained that lifeguard training included recognizing medical emergencies beyond drowning, heart attacks, seizures, diabetic episodes, and yes, visible anatomical changes that might indicate internal problems. He'd had to fight his own supervisor initially to escalate my situation, had been told he was overreacting, but he'd insisted something was seriously wrong and refused to let it go. That persistence had saved me, and I made sure he knew I'd be forever grateful. He asked about my recovery, about how I was managing, and I was honest about the financial devastation, the bankruptcy, the ongoing struggle to rebuild. He got quiet, then asked if I'd be willing to share my story with his lifeguard training class, to put a face to the medical emergencies they learned about abstractly. I agreed immediately, wanting to give something back to the profession that had given me continued existence. I spoke to Derek's training class in April, a group of 20 teenagers learning to save lives for minimum wage. I showed them the before and after pictures. Me at the pool looking normal, me 2 hours later with visible distension, me in the hospital connected to machines, me bald from chemo, me now in remission, but scarred. I explained how Derek's training and observation had identified something I'd completely missed, how his willingness to push past my skepticism had literally kept me alive. The teenagers listened with the kind of attention young people rarely give adult speakers, and several came up afterward to say they'd take their training more seriously now, that they hadn't realized how much impact they could have. One girl with bright pink hair said she wanted to become an EMT after hearing my story, that she'd been treating lifeguarding as just a summer job, but now saw it as something more meaningful. The 5-year mark came and went with clean scans, then the 10-year mark. Liam graduated high school, headed to college on a scholarship I'd watched him earn through intelligence and resilience, developed partly from watching his father fight cancer. My ex-wife had drifted to the periphery of his life after the custody battle, present for major events, but not much else. Her relationship with our son permanently damaged by her choices during my illness. Marcus and Ellen moved across the country for work, but we stayed close, our bond strengthened by the months they'd kept me alive. I eventually found work as a patient advocate at the hospital where I'd been treated, helping other people navigate the medical and financial nightmares that come with serious illness, turning my trauma into something useful. I saw Derek occasionally over the years. He became a paramedic, then a flight nurse on medical helicopters, saving lives in increasingly dramatic ways. We'd grab coffee sometimes, two people whose paths had intersected at a crucial moment, forever connected by the fact that his attention to detail and refusal to dismiss what he'd observed had given me another 30 years I wouldn't have had otherwise. He never made a big deal about it, always deflected credit, insisted he'd just been doing his job. But I knew better. Doing your job when it's easy is one thing. Doing it when the patient insists you're wrong, when your supervisors say you're overreacting, when every instinct says to just let it go, that's heroism in its quietest, most essential form. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.